Hi, kids. So let's go ahead and investigate Mali again through our book, If You Were Me and Lived in Ancient Mali. The king spent the day listening to people argue over disagreements. Sometimes it was about cattle, other times a fight over land. Either way, the sun was hot and the discussions were long and boring. Now remember, this is from a child's point of view. After all the disputes had been settled, your grandfather was called to the center of the courtyard. Your grandfather was known for his long memory. Since there was no written language, history was told by a storyteller. And right here, if we were actually in class together, I would say, what was this storyteller called? And hopefully your response would be a griot. The storyteller was called a griot, whose job was to memorize the stories. Your grandfather became the most famous griot in the land. He was ordered to come and live near the palace to be available to the king. The king nodded, and your grandfather cleared his throat to start his story. He took a deep breath, then began the great tale of the Mandinka people. Your grandfather sang in a booming voice that he received his knowledge from his father, who learned it from his own father, going back in time to when the people made their lives on the banks of the Niger River. The ancient people had divided into 12 clans with 12 kings to govern each group. Castes were created consisting of hunters, blacksmiths, and artisans. The castes were established, he explained, so that everyone would know their place in society. So castes would be like classes today. So like lower class, middle class, upper class. And so they did the same thing. So the hunters, the blacksmiths, and the artisans. And if you remember from talking about Greece and Rome, the artisans were also usually the educated people. Fighting broke out and there was chaos. For a long time there was war, which created poverty and hunger. The 12 kings formed a royal council and picked a Mansa to rule over them. The Mansa was to be all-powerful and rule all of Mandinka. This brought peace. For many years the Mandinka people prospered. Then the droughts came. There was no rain and all the crops died. Life was hard. Your grandfather continued the story of your people. He was crying when he told his part of the story. Animals were dying. The river dried up. People were starving. The king at the time, Mansa Baramanda, was told that if he embraced Islam, the drought would end. He converted and the rain came. The lands turned lush and green. There was great prosperity, which meant people grew wealthy and had plenty to eat. Many people followed his lead and converted to the new religion as well. Now, of course, you know that was a time when people still believed in signs and believed that if they did certain things, other things would happen. It was so quiet you could hear your heart beating. No one made a sound. Your grandfather stopped talking. He raised his hands to the sky. He said in a soft voice, "One day, terrible storm darkened the sky. The storm foretold the birth of a great leader. Then the lion child was born. He roared this part into a silent courtyard. All eyes were on your grandfather. The Almighty made the thunder peal, the sky light up, and the earth shake. He walked the length of the long courtyard. You noticed that nobody was moving. Every person was listening intently to your grandfather. Even Mansa Musa sat forward, his chin on his hand, his eyes sharp. Sundiata Keita was the bravest prince to ever live, your grandfather called out. He was Mansa Musa's grandfather, and his name meant hungering lion. Your grandfather told of Sundiata's inability to walk when he was a child. You remember we talked about that, how Mansa Sundiata, when he was first born, couldn't walk. And so he was looked over to be a leader because of that. You marveled at the story of how the blacksmith made braces for his legs, and the young prince taught himself to walk upright. Through hard work and exercise, he became the finest archer in the land, and he studied history and law. After a while, he was chosen to lead the army to overthrow an evil king. He united the many tribes, and together they began the Mali Empire. He took control of the valuable salt and gold mines, making the people thrive and grow rich. Remember, he was the one who came up with the trade routes. Everyone stood and cheered. This was the birth of your nation, and it filled you with pride. You smiled to yourself because you had heard it 100 times directly from your grandfather himself. You liked to listen when he taught your little brother to be the next griot in the family. As your grandfather prepared your brother, so his legacy continued. So did Sundiata Keita pave the way for his predecessor, Mansa Musa. Sundiata united the people, leaving a flourishing land for the next king. Mansa Musa continued his grandfather's plans by defeating the bandits who roamed the countryside, Mansa Musa continued his grandfather's plans by defeating the bandits who roamed the countryside, ruining the trades. This increased business, making Mali very rich. He was a just and fair ruler, encouraging all religions to be practiced. While he converted his followers Islam, he allowed religious tolerance in the kingdom, enabling people to worship as they pleased. Many people continued with both religions, combining Muslim beliefs with local traditions. Mansa Musa created the most informational seat of learning in Timbuktu, inviting scholars from all over the world to exchange knowledge, making his country important to the world development. He made education free for students. As you watched your grandfather speak, your mouth opened in wonder, and everyone bowed deeply to their great leader. How am I doing on time? Good. Your father was an important general in the army. He served Mansa Musa directly and led the army that guarded the gold mines. They were responsible for watching the trade routes. He had as much as 90,000 men on duty at one time. You knew the army had a wide variety of weapons to defend their riches. They used bows and barbed, poison-tipped arrows. Each warrior had a shield made from an animal hide. Most carried a stabbing spear called a tamba. The soldiers were fearsome, and you knew they kept your home as well as your roads safe. Your father looked grand in his chainmail armor. You watched as the courtyard was cleared, and the best warriors came forward to show their fighting skills in front of the Mansa. While your father was the head of your clan, he had many brothers that held other professions. Many of your relatives worked on the river unloading cargo or as sailors bringing products to your city. They had large herds of cattle that served as food sources for the markets. The most respected job was that of a farmer. The farmers lived on the fertile lands of the Niger River, tending the land to provide food for everyone. Some of your cousins lived away from the city in the countryside. They grew peanuts, cotton, and grains. In the winter, they served in the army, and in the summer, they returned to farming. Isn't that interesting? Because we have National Guardsmen who do something similar. They have one job during certain times of the year, and then they serve in the National Guard other times of the year. Below the farmers were the artisans. They were the craftsmen that created pottery and sculptures for worship. Some made things with leather. Others included soldiers, fishermen, and civil servants who worked for the government. Lastly were the unfortunate slaves who were captured to work in the gold and salt mines. Slaves were brought in from the Sahara by the caravans traveling from different parts of the world. You knew that Mali was an important part of the Arab slave trade. There were raids where people from nearby lands were captured and made into slaves. It was sad, but slaves were considered a valuable commodity rather than people. You heard your father complain that Mali was growing so fast that Mansa Musa couldn't hear all the complaints of the people. Your father suggested dividing the areas into provinces. Remember we talked about that? So they divided into sort of like states like we have now, and each state was going to have a governor, and then within those there would be like the mayors and things like that. So this was the beginning of a larger government. Mansa Musa agreed. He put governors called furbas in charge of each area. Each village had a mayor. Day-to-day problems would be taken care of locally, and Mansa Musa could govern the growing empire. There were inspectors called montrifs and royal tax collectors. Mali was organized and ran well. People had money and plenty to eat. Your father had to travel from town to town to make sure problems were handled fairly and the citizens were doing their jobs. You knew that the citizens were afraid to break the law. The punishment was fierce and fast. Liars had their tongues cut out. Thieves lost their hands. People learned it was better to follow the rules, so the land was peaceful. People loved to come and visit Mali. The roads were safe and the visitors were always welcome. All right, so that's where we're going to stop for today with our Mali book. And I hope you guys are enjoying learning about this ancient culture and how we still use a lot of the ways of these people, and of course the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. All of these ancient cultures had such a big influence on how we do things today as a culture all over the world. So this was a culture that was all the way across the globe from us, but we utilize a lot of the ways they did things back then and in their area. Look forward to an assignment for social studies where you guys will be griots of your own family and you'll be recording history. Oh, there's my alarm. And you'll be recording the history of your family and then uploading a video for me. So that'll be coming after spring break. So be thinking about that over spring break. And I know it'll be a little more difficult than I had anticipated because you can't get together physically, but it gives you an excuse to FaceTime with your grandparents or your aunts and uncles and collect some family history that will be very meaningful to you for a long time to come. Love you guys.